in Finland at the University of Helsinki. And she presently works as deputy head of the unit of infectious diseases in the Department of Health Security in the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare. So it's really a privilege to have her, because she's obviously, with the current crisis, quite busy considering her responsibilities in her own country. Not only that, but she served on, in the past on numerous advisory bodies, and is currently a member of the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts, and happens to be now the chair of the COVID working group, which is no small task, actually. So Hannah, the webinar is in your hands. Hannah?
Thanks a lot, Philip, and I'm very happy that you're arranging this ADVAC webinar, because we do need to get together to discuss issues. And I'm very happy today that you chose the topic. Joachim and us in SAGE have been working and sweating with the topic on the COVID vaccination policies. And I'm so happy that Joachim has now accepted to lead us into the thinking. Joachim, as you know, is a medical doctor who serves as a senior health advisor to WHO, principal advisory body on SAGE in the Department of Immunization, Vaccines and Biologicals in Geneva. And he's advising the Director of Immunization, Kate O'Brien, and provides leadership in all areas covered by the SAGE Advisory Committee related working groups. And I've had the privilege of working with Joachim now since June on the COVID-19 vaccinations. Before taking this Executive Secretary of SAGE position, Joachim was serving as an advisor responsible for research support, the development of global immunization policies such as maternal immunization, and being focal point for technical portfolios including dengue and yellow fever. So he's been boiled in several very difficult, demanding issues before. And before joining WHO, Joachim has a career focused on vaccine research and related implementation sciences, which he's done in GlaxoSmithKline Biologicals, and before that as a scientific officer in the European Commission. And in that latter function, he was actually instrumental in setting up the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership, EDCTP platform. So we're very happy to have Joachim with all his extensive knowledge to give us an overview to what right now the SAGE is thinking in the strategies for deployment of the COVID-19 vaccine. So Joachim, with that introduction, please share your thoughts on the SAGE deliberations with us. Over to you.
So thanks very much, Hannah, for this very kind introduction, and thanks to the ADVACers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to give this introductory presentation to what I certainly think will be a very interesting discussion in the forthcoming 2 hours. I have to say there's probably people on the panel who are almost better suited to present the topic, but I'm very happy to do it. And I have taken a little bit of a liberal interpretation of the assignment that Phil gave me, strategies for the deployment of COVID-19 vaccines. I talk particularly about the perspective on policy development and country readiness. So let's go to the next slide. All right. So I really would like to start with the acknowledgements, because obviously this is work that is done by many. Hannah already referred to it. I mean, most of the work I'm presenting is actually coming out of the SAGE working group on COVID-19 vaccination, where Hannah is the chair. Particularly thanks really to a couple of individuals in this group who have been really pushing the work forward in relation to the initial stages of policy with Faden, Omer, Sonali, Korha, Hannah, as I said, Annalise Wilder-Smith. And I'm also using some materials that Anne Lindstrand, our EPI coordinator, has provided to me, which is in relation to delivery. So let's take the next slide. And just quickly, my presentation outline. So I really want to start with some few words on the disease epidemiology, burden of disease. Obviously, this is critical for shaping all subsequent work. And I really have to say, we are in a very unusual situation in terms of preparing policy and preparing for delivery while so many things are still in flux in terms of better understanding of the epidemiology of the disease, better understanding in terms of what the vaccines will, what the profile of the vaccine is going to be, and many, many other aspects that are currently evolving. And there's a lot of work that is going on in parallel. And then I would talk about vaccination policy, where we are, and also a few words about, obviously, country readiness and delivery strategy considerations. Next slide is really the, if you move to the next, thank you. This is just, so to say, the usual introductory slide, which shows you essentially the dashboard from WHO in terms of coronavirus disease, confirmed cases and death. I've taken this snapshot this weekend. You know the figures. You know also that many people think that the death estimates may be significant underestimates. I'm sure we'll be talking about this at some point during this discussion. We see actually what's interesting is that in terms of the confirmed cases, they're going up, but relatively flat to some extent. There's about 2 million cases per week, if I'm not mistaken. And the majority of cases that are currently reported are apparently in the middle age. And but to get a bit more, a better understanding where we are, the next slide shows you the situation, how it looks in the regions. Next slide. Yes, wonderful. So this is 10 days old, but I don't think this makes a big difference. It's actually quite interesting to see that the epidemic curves and the epidemiological situation for cases and deaths as depicted here look very, very different in the different WHO regions. And when you, for instance, look at Europe, you see clearly we are in the second wave. All of those who are living in Europe know this very well. While the cases of death remain relatively low, but start to creep up. And then you have, for instance, when you look at the African region, and I'm sure also this is something that we'll be discussing at some point, we actually see a downward trend, both in reported cases as well as in relation to fatalities. And so I think understanding the epidemic curves and the epidemiology is really quite challenging. The next question, and this is on the next slide, and is the question about really the number of infections. And I've taken the liberty to take a graphic from a general magazine from The Economist, which I like actually this graph, which is essentially an estimation of an estimation of daily number of infections. And this is obviously based on a large array of zero surveys that have been looking at and compared those with the reported cases and then calculated what they call multipliers between what is estimated as infections and what is reported cases. And this is obviously really a kind of a back on the envelope calculation. And you see here the so-called multipliers for a number of countries, and they conclude that there should be probably a kind of global estimated multiplier of around 20, and then they calculate that there are probably some 500 to 730 million infections, which means 6 to 9% of the world population. There is actually no WHO figure on this, at least I'm not aware of, maybe I've missed it, but the Director General actually last week, and maybe this report was even a trigger, mentioned the figure of that there may be today around 10% of the world population infected, which is a lot, but which also means there's still a lot to come. And to some extent, we are still pretty early in the pandemic. What I personally find surprising is actually when you look at this and the daily reported figures and how they relate to the reported cases, that in my mind doesn't really fit together, but this is just my own observation. So let's move on. Next slide is also, I think, an important consideration is obviously about fatality rates, and obviously we normally look at case fatality rates, but it's of course very important to understand, particularly with what I referred to a minute ago, at the infection fatality rates. And this is from a systematic review and meta-analysis done by Levin, looking at the infection fatality rate and age. And what you see here is really this really incredible exponential relationship between age and infection fatality rates for COVID-19. And what this paper actually claims is that this type of relationship, I mean, obviously, when you look at countries and regions with hugely different demographics, can largely explain why from certain regions we have much less reported deaths with all other caveats than from others. I mean, if you, for instance, think about that in Europe, we have about 20% of the population, which is about 65, and in sub-Saharan Africa, it's just 3%. But I'm sure many other factors will play in as well. So let's go to the next slide, which is risk factor analysis. And obviously, age is the most important one. We already referred to this. But there's, of course, many others, as we know. This is from a study from England, published in Nature, which gives you fully adjusted hazard ratios for a number of characteristics and conditions. And what is clearly standing out is that age is really the most important one, but there are many other risk factors, obesity, and ethnicity, certain health conditions. What is also, I think, interesting is that what they call as deprivation is a risk factor, and a number of others. We do not have a lot of data from risk factor analysis from low and middle income countries, so this is a major data gap, and again, probably something we'll discuss further. Next slide. Just in terms of the key observations, I think don't need to go through all of this. I think what is really important for us is really that we don't have many data from low and middle income countries. And we need really to get a better understanding also from more representative seroprevalence studies. And obviously it will be extremely important to understand what this immunity means in terms of also really protection and its duration and so forth. So major questions we have out in relation to the epidemiology. Okay, next slide. Let's move to the policy development part. We can move directly to the next. And so what we have decided, and really recognizing that countries are in need of early guidance in order to prepare for COVID vaccination, is to take a stepwise approach and essentially work with, call it, intermediates. While we are not yet in a position, obviously, to develop vaccination policies, because we haven't got a vaccine yet. So we started actually with a values framework for the allocation and prioritization of COVID vaccination, really about high-level principles and objectives, under the consideration of the broadest impact that COVID has in terms of individual health, public health, society, and economy. And that was endorsed by SAGE and is published. And then the next step was to move from there to the prioritization of target population under certain supply constrained situations and different epidemiological settings. And that is something that we discussed last week and which was also endorsed. And only then at a later step, when vaccines will be coming, will we be able to really make vaccine specific vaccination recommendation, really looking at the product specific characteristica, and also considering under what type of regulatory regime these products will come onto the market. So this is essentially for the future, and I'm not going to talk about this further here. That is for us collectively to see. So let's move to the next slide. Coming to the so-called values framework, and I'm not going to spend much time on this. But it's really the idea is to have a high-level document that encourages decision makers to think through competing demands with an explicit recognition of the goals and principles that are at stake. So it's a document that bases on core principles, ethical principles, develops from their objectives in terms of what a vaccination program should achieve, and from there lists a number of priority groups, which are not ranked in this document, around 20 priority groups that fit to the vaccination objectives and core principles that are defined. I have just, I think, one more slide if you go on this. And again, it's not to read through it, but just to show you here that basically for the different principles that are laid out here, we have defined objectives in terms of what needs to be achieved with or through an immunization program. And then there's a subsequent step where we have priority populations, which I'm not showing here because that will also come in the so-called roadmap, which I will present in a minute. So let's move on to the next. Just to show this is on the web and this as a document, and we are working on disseminating this. I think what is more important for the discussion here is then the next step that we undertook, which was discussed and endorsed last week at the SAGE, and this is on the next slide, which is what we call a roadmap towards the prioritization of target population. And it's really really a next step effort with more granularity, with more specificity to support country planning in terms of target priority groups for different level of vaccine supply and for different epidemiological settings, essentially as shown here on the right-hand side as a 3x3 table. And there's a couple of assumptions that go into this in order to get the work starting. We obviously assume that we have a licensed product, that it meets certain performance criteria as we have defined them or as they are defined in a WHO target product profile. There is the assumption that the vaccine has at least some level of performance also in older age groups, the same also true for some subpopulations, that non-pharmaceutical interventions continue. We start on the assumption that we will not have much information on the effect of transmission, but that such information may gradually come as the products are being used. And there's no, I think that's important to note, there's no account of seroprevalence at that point in time, because also we do not really know what seroprevalence means. Next slide gives a couple of other considerations. This is, I mean, we looked obviously at findings from mathematical modeling. This is some summary figures that Nick Grassley and Sarah Pallas from the working group put together. We had gone through a request for information and reviewed what has been modeled so far. Most studies took a look at optimal strategy for age-based vaccination. Some looked at comorbidities, health and social care workers. And there were a couple of very clear outcomes in terms of the prioritization of older people in relation to prevention of mortality and more severe morbidity. There's also some major data gaps that were identified, really important for us. For instance, no information on dense urban neighborhoods, which are obviously very important also for low and middle income countries. And there's a number of other important gaps. But nevertheless, this was an informative piece that we also took into consideration when developing the roadmap. The next slide, and this is basically giving a little bit of an explanation for what is coming on the subsequent slide. The vaccine supply, so we have taken scenarios of very limited supply, just up to 10%, then fairly restricted supply, 10 to 20%, and then moderate supply in terms of 20 to 50%. These stages are also connected to other work that is going on access and allocation in relation to the so-called COVAX facility. And so the idea is that one basically moves through the 3 stages and that you don't jump a stage, that you don't go from 1 to 3 or start from 2 and go to 1. And within the stages, there are different groups that have been identified. They are not rank ordered with the exception of the very first phase, as you would see in the next slide. But what is very clear is that this roadmap is providing broad orientation. It's not a definitive thing. We see it as a living document, and it's also absolutely clear that countries need to contextualize, and they need to understand in terms of, for instance, if we recommend starting with older ages, I mean, what older ages mean, what are the age cutoffs, are things that countries need to decide themselves, because every country is really different. The message really of this roadmap is, first of all, clearly in a situation of very little supply, focus on mortality reduction, focus on the maintenance of most essential functions in society. And really the overall message is, it's not ration. We are not talking about rationing. We are talking about targeting for really optimal impact along transparent and ethical criteria. So the next slide, and again, this is not really to read, and sorry, this is very busy, and this is really taken from a presentation to SAGE. Just gives you the 3 stages, as I just mentioned it. And then this is under the epidemiological scenario of community transmission. So we have the same for clusters of transmission only, and then no transmission. And here you see the priority populations in stage 1A for the initial launch, starting with health workers at high risk of acquiring and transmitting infection, followed by older age groups. And then if the vaccine supply relaxes somewhat, expanding on older age groups, going into comorbidities, socio-demographic groups, which particularly risks, which could be otherwise disadvantaged populations, health workers, priority teachers, and so forth. And then the stage 3 goes broader and certainly brings then also into consideration aspects of reduction of transmission. Next slide, very briefly, national efforts to define priorities are going on by a number of countries. I think we have overall good concordance with our findings, obviously, and recommendations. Obviously, countries themselves go into more detail, which is something that we at the global level are not doing. But it is good to see that these analyses actually come to fairly concordant perspective in terms of prioritization. Okay, just a few minutes, next slide, on country readiness and delivery. It's not my area of expertise, I have to say, but let me say a few words about this. Next slide. I've taken this slide actually from Kate O'Brien's presentation to SAGE last week, because I think it is very nice in terms of showing the challenge, which shows the vaccine uptakes into national schedules, how much time it takes, and what we anticipate to do for COVID. And not only anticipate to do very, very quickly, but we also anticipate to go into populations that we normally don't reach. And so that's certainly a challenge which is out there, which requires all our concerted efforts. Next slide is just showing you, and there's not a perfect fit to what I showed in previous slides, it's just some estimation about the potential target group sizes in terms of older people, health workers, and so forth. It's important to note that in countries, proportionally what these different groups represent can be very, very different, can be huge differences between countries. There's, by the way, also huge differences in the representation of women and men in these different groups. And so just as a reminder. And the next slide gives you an overview slide in terms of the work that is being done in a whole work stream on country readiness and delivery, where, as you see on the right hand, various groups come together: WHO, UNICEF, Gavi, Gates, CDC, International Federation of Red Cross. And basically we have cross-cutting, 3 to 4 cross-cutting areas, and we have a number of technical areas on which people are working along really, you know, in a parallel manner in terms of supply, logistics, demand, vaccine introduction, readiness, and then obviously cross-cutting issues in relation to data, monitoring, communications, and so forth. The next slide gives you just a snapshot on a few pieces of work that are going on. There is a vaccine introduction readiness assessment tool, which is essentially a checklist that has been prepared. There is guidance for national deployment and vaccination plans for COVID vaccines to assist countries really in developing their plans. There's cold chain guidance that is being developed. And as I mentioned, there's various working groups. I think there will be a lot of country contextualization. There's a lot of lessons learned also from others that feed in. And so I think, I mean, all this global guidance that is being developed is very, needs to be very flexible and needs to be reviewed whenever we have more information on what obstacles countries see, what type of information we get on the vaccines, what additional specificity we have on target population. Next slide just gives you a snapshot in terms of some regional discussions, in terms of, you know, what are our experiences, what are our learnings in terms of different target populations, health and social workers. Obviously, we have experience from flu vaccination particularly, but also Hep B, to some extent, measles containing vaccines, and obviously also from the pandemic. Delivery considerations. What do we have in terms of vaccinating older people? Here's some figures from Euro. Again, it's mostly from influenza. Some considerations in terms of how the delivery could be done. Medical risk groups, very difficult. I mean, obviously, if you count pregnancy in this, that's a group where we have decent experience. For others, very little. And so that is a major challenge in terms of moving forward, and where there's a lot of active work going on. Next slide, just a reminder that even though we may get nice vaccines, not everybody might be interested in those. And this is just, you know, a collection of press clips that we have seen over the last weeks and months. So I think, and this is possibly my last word, I think I just have then the last slide. I think to sum this up, I think if we do the work on COVID vaccination, the policy, the rollout, everything that goes with it, if we do it well, I think we'll be able to boost the whole enterprise of immunization very nicely. If it doesn't go well, we may actually damage immunization, and I'm talking of immunization as a whole, quite considerably. So I think the stakes are pretty high, and that's where we are. So last slide, let's get into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim, for that excellent introduction to the very difficult and demanding topic. I understand, Philippe, that you're at the standby with the chat box and questions and answers. And there is actually already one question before we take in our panelists on how will COVAX vaccine allocation work if there are contrasting recommendations between the country NITAC and the SAGE. Would you want to take that, Joachim?
I'm first of all checking, are the questions all coming to me, or are we dealing with this as a panel?
We have almost 10 panelists who will be commenting onto and asking questions and also commenting from their perspective. But we at the same time also have the question and answer box. And I thought that while the panelists are getting their thoughts together, we could take this specific one, because you didn't really talk very much about the COVAX. So how will COVAX vaccine allocation work if there are contrasting recommendations between a country, NITAC, and SAGE?
So I think, that's correct. I haven't talked about COVAX. There's only so much you can put into one presentation. Under the COVAX facility, and there is a plan for vaccine access and allocation, which I briefly referred to, where there is a so-called proportional phase in the beginning that goes up to 20% of population, and where essentially countries get, as vaccine come in, vaccine proportional to the population size. What the countries do with the vaccine is ultimately their choice. I mean, obviously, we develop this guidance so that countries have orientation and guidance, and we also will proactively disseminate this and have communications with countries and regions so that they go themselves through this process. But it is ultimately, strictly speaking, at the discretion of the countries. So if a country would decide to use the vaccine differently, I think they could do it, right? So I think this is, that's not necessarily something where you would need to, where, so to say, in the COVAX process, you would put it on hold and say, no, in this case, you're not going to get the vaccine. That's not the case. But we have also in our principles, we have laid out this principle of legitimacy, which basically says you need to take decisions that are rational, that are transparent, and that are ethically justifiable. And I think if you go through this process, you will probably end up with recommendations that would not be very different from what we are developing.
Okay, then this next question from Dominikus Husada, who's from ADVAC 2011, it goes pretty much in similar lines about country differences. He's asking that some countries decided to give mass vaccination early. China already gave to some people there. Indonesia will start at end of October. However, no international data of phase 3 at this moment. What are the current comments of WHO?
So I think WHO has made it actually very clear, and that we expect to see clinical efficacy data. It's encoded in the target product profile. WHO has also very recently released an expression of interest to manufacturers to submit files for a pre-qualification or for emergency use application, with, again, requirements in terms of clinical data. And the expectation is that there should be data on clinical efficacy with a minimum duration of follow-up provided. And I think it is, we cannot speak to individual countries' decisions here, but I think it is certainly problematic if you are not in a situation of extreme risk to use a vaccine where you have not really shown and demonstrated clinical efficacy.
Thanks. Pedro Carbes from ADVAC 2012 is asking, what's your thought on managing global access to COVID-19 vaccines in the case that supply do not to attend such global demand?
Well, I think, again, I mean, it would probably require a whole presentation on the COVAX facility, where I'm also not the ultimate specialist, but I think this is the reason why this COVAX facility was set up, is to make sure that all countries have access to COVID vaccine as it becomes available. And obviously, some of the, I think, probably fairly bitter learnings from the 2009 influenza pandemic, where many countries, and particularly the lower income countries, got the vaccine certainly too late. And so the COVAX facility is an opportunity to, or is a way to circumvent this, but is also, and this makes it attractive also to higher level income countries, an opportunity to pool risk, because the COVAX facility is contracting with a number of manufacturers, and then you get, and then countries have an assured supply, which however comes obviously in phases, and you can only distribute as much vaccine as you can get from the manufacturers, but in a proportional scale. So there should not be one country being put at an advantage over another country in relation to the distribution of the vaccine.
Yeah, I can speak for the European Union perspective that the strategy there is that the member states get the vaccines pro rata to what proportion their population makes up of the total EU population. So in that sense, we are trying to do solidarity approach there. There is a next question from Shinara Aidralieva, who says that in 2009, WHO focused heavily on delivery and distribution of the pandemic vaccine, the deployment, while the uptake was quite low in many countries due to low demand and mild pandemic. Where will the focus be this time? On vaccination strategies, on uptake, on behavioral change?
That's a tough question, I have to say, and I think what I think, and with the roadmap where I showed you really just a snapshot on it, what we are emphasizing is really to start with populations that are at fairly high risk of mortality and severe morbidity. And I think that is probably something that will need to put into the equation when you talk about demand for vaccines. So I think I would estimate and presume that for these populations there would be significant demand of vaccines, because we are talking about populations, older people, health workers that are at significant risk of exposure, where a vaccine really could provide, provides a very tangible and easy to communicate benefit. I think it also makes sense if you start using a vaccine, in particular if you start using a vaccine which is authorized under emergency use conditions, which we don't know, it may be a fully registered vaccine, that you have a very careful look at a benefit risk assessment. So I think that is where we are starting from. And I would think that in the early periods and in the early phases, I would think that we wouldn't probably not have major issues in terms of demand and uptake. I think we would have issues in terms of delivery and deployment and reaching populations, because this is something that outside high-income countries and a few middle-income countries, there is really not a lot of experience. If you go beyond this, if you go to broader populations, I think all bets are open. And I think it depends probably also very much on the way the pandemic evolves.
Maybe I'll take the next question from Roger Glass, who is the ADVAC scientific faculty member, who is asking, will WHO expedite their regulatory clearance on vaccines? How will licensing issues be handled for vaccines from different countries? And will WHO only recommend those that are WHO pre-qualified? And how long of follow-up will be required to rule out adverse events?
Well, this is not one question, this is a series of questions. And I really would like also, I mean, if people on the panel have perspectives, I think that would also be good. But let me take the elements that relate to WHO. WHO obviously is not a regulator, and but we accept, or WHO accepts files for pre-qualification and also for emergency use listing under certain conditions. That's all on the web. But these must be products that are developed in countries and are under regulatory oversight by what we call is a stringent regulatory authority. So I think this is the way we proceed. That's the way products come to WHO. Every effort is being made that these processes are extremely fast and expedited, and as national authorities do in terms of rolling review, the same is being done by WHO in terms of their assessment for pre-qualification or emergency use listing. So we should not be thinking of business as usual and waiting half a year or a year for a WHO review. That's not going to happen. So this will be I wouldn't say on time, you know, but it really goes, it will be going very fast. And WHO, I mean, we very much encourage pre-qualification and emergency use listing and the process through WHO, which probably builds also confidence in countries. But obviously, I think this is not strictly speaking needed. Many factors may opt to move otherwise. WHO can very well issue positions and recommendations on vaccines that are not pre-qualified. We do this. However, we again request that these vaccines are under supervision by a stringent regulatory authority.
Thanks. And if we now have Stanley Plotkin among the panelists, I would like to put the next question from the Child Health Foundation from Naveen Thacker, who was an ADVACer in 2007. He's asking, what about children when they get vaccines, considering their role in transmission? So I wonder if Stanley is around and would care to answer.
Yeah, sure. Do you hear me?
Yes, very well.
All right. Well, excuse me, but I have a number of things to say. First, well, and I'll come back to the point about children's. The first thing to say, I would like to say to Joachim and to WHO that I think they've done a very good job in this emergency. I've served on one of their task forces, so I know how much effort has gone into this. This is a situation in the vaccine world where all hands are on deck. We've never had so many different candidate vaccines for a disease, which from a scientific point of view is great, but it also imposes on us choices and evaluation of different types of vaccine. Now, one of the points I would make is that we don't know yet what the effect of the individual vaccines will be, and specifically, as long as a vaccine generates antibodies to the receptor binding domain, it's going to prevent a disease to a medium or great extent. But whether it will prevent mucosal replication of the virus is a key point in terms of the epidemiology of the disease. And we know nothing about that at the moment, or very little, which is one reason why I and Peter Smith, who may be on the call also, have been advocating human challenge studies in order to determine rapidly whether vaccines can prevent mucosal infection or not. And I won't go into a lot of discussion about human challenges, but they could be done in young, healthy people, and they would give us a lot of information, particularly about correlates of protection. What are the immune responses that we need to generate? So, you know, there have been two philosophical approaches to the question of vaccination. Of course, the approach which Joachim outlined about vaccinating the groups most susceptible and most exposed is certainly logical, and from an ethical point of view, certainly a good choice. But on the other hand, one can argue that one should focus on the transmitters, not on those who have most disease. Now, I can say that because I'm in the high-risk group. So, you know, in principle, I would love to get the vaccine. That being said, it's the young active people who are transmitting the virus, and that includes young adults. It doesn't include children, by the way. They are not major transmitters of the disease, but young adults are. And it could be argued that from the economic point of view and from the public health point of view, that we should be aiming not at the elderly like me, but on the young, healthy people to reduce the risk to everybody, including the elderly. Now, the exception I would make is elderly in institutions, where the infection rate is very high, and those are the weakest individuals. They have multiple medical issues, and I would put them as being a first choice group for vaccination. The other remarks I would make, which Joachim touched on, was the issue of mandatory vaccination. It seems to me that if we're ever going to control this disease, if we're ever going to reduce and perhaps eliminate the virus in the long term, it's going to require a very high vaccine coverage. And in some countries, that will be sort of automatic because they like vaccines. But in Europe and the US, I think mandatory vaccination is eventually going to have to come into play if we're going to eliminate, I won't say eradicate, but at least eliminate COVID-19. And the vaccines might be combined with influenza vaccines. So you would have high coverage for influenza as well as for SARS-2. So I think we need to think about this not in the usual ways. I think we need fresh thinking about how to control this disease, which is wreaking havoc on the world. It's not just the mortality, it's the economic destruction and to some extent the destruction of society that we're dealing with. So let's be realistic and do things differently, not just in the old ways. And having given you my, what shall I say, unedited opinions, I will stop there.
Thanks a lot, Stanley. Sorry?
Hannah, before we go any further, could I ask all the discussants basically to go on video? I think that'll be nicer for those waiting and observing the discussion. And also, just to say, Hannah, that we have all the discussants that were finally connected, but Alfred Duba, it seems that he was unable to connect. So hopefully he'll join, but it's not sure. Over.
Thanks a lot. I mean, is there something in Stanley's commentary, Joachim, that you want to respond to before we move with the next question, next panel?
Maybe very quickly. I think, Stanley, the points you're making are very good. I just want to flag that, in particular, in relation to your last point, that we are dealing with more than just an impact on health, but on society at large. And And I think that is actually something, and when you have a moment to read through our documentation, you will find it actually very clearly in there. I think that's exactly the approach we have taken. Nevertheless, you need to think about in terms of what do you do when you start and you have very little vaccine? What do you do with very little vaccine? With very little vaccine, you will not have an impact on transmission. Apart from the fact, as you pointed out, that in the beginning, we won't have the data, right? Or most likely won't have the data. And then, and so I think that is, so I think the considerations that you have made, I totally share, and I think you find them in the document. We have put things into a certain sequence of events in terms of our understanding of the supply and some general principles. But in the end of the day, you can always discuss how do you prioritize. But the thing which is very clear is that in the beginning, if you have just a few % of vaccine, there's very little you can do in relation to reducing transmission.
May I then invite our next panelist, Peter Smith, who Stanley also referred to, on sharing your thoughts on the challenge studies, because this is something that we are eagerly waiting for, the transmission blocking sterilizing vaccine. It seems like many of the companies are not really addressing that in their trials. So is the challenge study an alternative to cut corners? Peter.
Yeah, I'll come back to that, Hannah, if I may, at the end. I just want to make a few other remarks. And as you know, I've been sitting on the SAGE working group on COVID vaccines. And I have to say it's been an interesting but somewhat frustrating experience, because normally when SAGE considers in a working group a new vaccine and a policy with respect to that vaccine, it has sort of phase 3 data on that vaccine. We have a trial that's been conducted in the primary target population, and it's got follow-up data for 1, possibly 3, possibly 5 years. We've got none of that at the moment. So we're talking about theoretical vaccines that we don't know really what any of the properties are. We're assuming that vaccines are going to have particular properties. That remains a pretty big assumption at the moment. And what we'd really like is a vaccine that prevents infection, for the sort of reasons that Stanley's outlined. But it seems that that might be quite a big ask. And it certainly seems that most of the developers are not prepared to put all of their eggs in that basket. And they've not made infection a primary endpoint. It's normally a secondary endpoint, but it's not, as far as I know, a primary endpoint in any of the ongoing phase 3 trials. The phase 3 trials are enormous that are ongoing, and hopefully they're going to be producing results in the next, well, before the end of the year or early next year, at least the leading ones. But I fear that they still are not going to really give us the information that we need to have at this stage. And it's still going to be necessary to proceed with a number of assumptions. First of all, the trials are, although they include the elderly in the trials, most of them are not focused on the elderly, which is, as Joachim has said, is going to be the target group for initial vaccination. So we're not really going to have very good data, I think, on whether the vaccines work against severe disease in the elderly. What we're going to have, and most of the, I think all of the trials just use symptomatic disease of any kind as their endpoint. And I suspect there are going to be too few cases of severe disease to really come to any firm conclusion about the efficacy of vaccines against that which is the key endpoint, and also particularly against the efficacy of that in the elderly, which I think the trials are not going to give us the information that we really require. And it will be necessary to make some sort of immune bridging to assume effects which are going to be observed predominantly in the younger part of the trial population, see if they carry over into the elderly. So that's one bit of information we're not going to have. The other bit of information we're not going to have is how long any protection that is actually conferred by these vaccines is going to last. Follow-up maybe will be less than 6 months with some of them. And a vaccine that gives protection for no more than 6 months, although it will have some value, it's going to have very limited value in terms of controlling this pandemic. So many of these questions are not going to stop widespread use of the vaccines. If we get an efficacious vaccine, it will be deployed, provided it's safe, at least in the short term. But it leaves a whole number of post-licensure, post-authorization usage studies that have really got to be designed now, because we're not going to get some of the answers to those questions from the randomized trials, because I don't think it will, for example, be possible to continue the placebo group once efficacy is shown in many of those trials. I know that is the plan in some of them, but we'll see if that is politically and ethically acceptable. If we get from these initial trials a correlate of protection, then that will help us make assessments for, as it were, the next group of vaccines, for vaccines of a particular type. But we may not get that. And it may be that the vaccines that are, as it were, further back in the pipeline are going to be better vaccines than the vaccines that are, as it were, first past the post with respect to doing their phase 3 trials. Once we've got those phase 3 trials done in sort of 30, 40,000 people typically, when the other vaccines come into testing, I doubt it's going to be possible, feasible, or acceptable to do the sort of phase 3 trials of those other vaccines that are being done for these initial vaccines. It will be difficult to find the populations, vaccines will be in use, really, really challenging to do those trials. So how are we going to evaluate those vaccines? If we've got a correlate of protection, we may be able to do it if it's reasonable to jump from one vaccine to another with respect to that correlate. But I think this is where, and this really goes back to your initial question, Hannah, and the comment that Stanley made. This is where actual challenge studies may be really very valuable, because it may enable one to take some of those second generation vaccines, validate them with the vaccines that we've already got some data on, which we will have by early next year, to see if we get the same results from challenge studies. And with that validation of the approach, we can use that to either choose which of the, as it were, further down the pipeline vaccines should be taken into larger phase 3 trials, or even possibly actually taking them into extended use if the initial vaccines don't have impressive efficacy. So I think there's a whole big research agenda. It's going to be very difficult to make these decisions about how to use vaccines that we really don't know the properties of. I think the plan that's been outlined in the stage working group that Joachim discussed is fine in the abstract, as it were, when we don't have a product. But it may well be necessary to modify that plan once we've got some products available and we have a better idea of what some of the properties of those products may be, but we won't know about some of the properties that we really need to know how effective these vaccines are going to be. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Peter. Joachim, do you have comments to Peter's deliberations?
I think Peter is spot on, and I think what you just said in the end, I mean, this document is fine in the abstract, right? And we need to do it because we need to provide orientation to countries, and this is our best understanding. But as I said also in my presentation, there's a lot of assumptions, and some of them may prove to be wrong. And in the end of the day, it is, I mean, the performance of the vaccines and what we know about them will have a major influence in terms of how we're going to use them. Absolutely true.
Thanks. Let me then pick up from the questions that we got. I mean, there's a question from Ahmed Faisal asking whether will we exclude patients who were positive for COVID by any method of testing, and how is that handled right now in the trials, and how will that be handled in the introductory phase? Do we have anybody amongst the panelists who would have an answer to that?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there will be, in the clinical trials, there will be many people who have been previously infected. And so that we will get information as to one, whether they are boosted by the vaccine, which may be useful, because we already know that not everybody who gets infected with COVID-19 develops a good systemic response. We already know that. So a vaccine might be a good thing even for people who have been previously infected. But the other point, of course, is that we don't yet know for sure how solid immunity is from prior infection. And so there again, that may be a reason for not only including seropositives in the trial, but studying them to determine whether or not, when they're subsequently exposed to COVID-19, are they resistant after vaccination compared to those who received placebo. So the point that I'm making is that including seropositives, or I should say including people who have had prior infection, whether seropositive or not at that point, will give us valuable information. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Stanley. And my understanding is that in most of these trials, they actually are testing the sera status. So that information will be coming in due course. So far, there are about 26 reports on reinfection among those who have been found either PCR positive or sera positive. So the numbers on the reports are very low in comparison to how many we know that have been infected, the millions of people, but information is coming up on reinfection as well. Then let's take a question from Tatiana Gimaresh, who is an ADVACer from 2010. And she's asking, what about the Solidarity vaccine clinical trial? Any predictions on what vaccines will be included? What is the estimate for starting the trial? And I guess we would also want to know when we'll get results from those trials. Joachim, are you in the position to answer to that question to Tatiana?
To be perfectly honest, no. I don't know exactly where the status is. I mean, maybe Peter, do you have insights, because you have also been advising the R&D blueprint?
No, I don't really have up-to-date data on that. I know a number of developers have expressed interest in entering those their vaccines into the Solidarity trial, which is probably most people are aware. This is a sort of adaptive trial in which it's planned to try to evaluate multiple vaccines, as it were, at the same time against a placebo group. So it would rather, and essentially it's doing a head-to-head trial with a lot of different vaccines. That's the plan. It's I think it's a very innovative plan, but it's also quite an ambitious plan. I know a number of developers have expressed interest. I know a large number of sites have expressed interest in participating, but quite what stage it's reached, I'm not sure.
Okay, something that we need to find out. Thanks. There's a question from Linda Eckert from ADVAC 2018 on how does WHO view pregnant women in the population risk stratification for COVID vaccines? Joachim or Peter?
Yeah, if you take the roadmap paper that we discussed last week, you actually find a bit of discussion around pregnancy. I mean, there is increasing evidence that pregnancy may be associated with an elevated risk of serious disease. I mean, this is, I think, still accumulating evidence, but it points into this direction. So on the other hand side, as we all know, for all new vaccines, pregnant women are not necessarily readily included. So we are again in a situation where we would have to deal with the questions about safety, probably less about in terms of effectiveness, but safety of the vaccines in this population. Strong call from WHO. that data on safety of vaccines in pregnancy should be generated. For the time being, we have not particularly prioritized pregnant women in our line listing, if I may say so. Also from a consideration of a benefit risk assessment, as we anticipate that we won't have immediately data on the safety of vaccines in pregnancy. But I think strong call that these be generated. At the same time, a better understanding in terms of where we are in relation to the risk that pregnant women have in relation to COVID vaccination, and eventually to prioritize them. So they're currently not really prioritized, but the issue is really flagged and requires follow-up.
Thanks, and maybe I could then invite our panelist Edward Abuao from Kenya, who is in the National Medical Regulatory Institute there, whether you have a comment to the pregnancy, and maybe you could take also the next question from Boston Zimba in ADVAC 2020. When we have the licensed vaccine, will countries be going to wait for WHO pre-qualification, or will it be done concurrently? So if Edward Abuao is there, I think these would be very relevant questions for you to answer.
For Kenya, I just want to say first, I'll not be talking on behalf of the regulatory authority itself, but what I'd like to say is that I know as Africa, in terms of pre-qualification, when a product is pre-qualified, it becomes much easier and faster to register it in the African region, because the regulatory authorities in Africa also participate in the pre-qualification processes. So that makes work a bit easier, but because of this pandemic, there can also be joint evaluation of the dossier for this product. It doesn't necessarily mean that if someone wants to register this product, like in Africa, they'll have to go through pre-qualification. They can still also be submitted directly to the regulatory authorities, but it makes work much easier and faster if the product is already pre-qualified. I know there are some other routes that can be used, including joint evaluation, whereby because of the regional economic blocks, they meet together and review this. So there both ways can happen, but I know pre-qualification makes work much faster. In terms of women, again, it will depend on the safety data that is available. I know for clinical trials, sometimes they avoid recruiting expectant mothers just for the safety part of it, because of the safety. But if the data is there that can show some safety on that, then that will be allowed. But again, all this will depend on what data is submitted for review. Thank you.
Thanks, Edward. And do you have any more messages to this audience as a panelist?
Nothing much from now, maybe later, I'm not sure. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks a lot. Then let me take the next question here. There's the question from Becky Dagbo, who is ADVAC 2008 from Nigeria, asking any considerations and plans for populations where transmission is significant but demand will be potentially low. What are the considerations and plans for that purpose? Do you want to take that, Joachim, at this point?
It would be interesting to know from Mr. Tagbo if he had any specific populations in place, but in mind. Sorry, but I think you know, it's a matter of concern, as we discussed already. I mean, you have seen my little snapshots from the press, which obviously came from high-income countries, but it's clear that, you know, we will have some such perspective also in some low-income countries. I think, and there's a whole work stream in terms of communication that is being developed in terms of, I think, not very different in relation to other vaccines, that the benefits, the risks, that these elements are being properly discussed. I personally think that demand of in relation to these vaccines will primarily depend on confidence that people have into the products, into the regulatory processes that have been used, into the independence and rigor of policy. I think this is really, I think, what is going to make the difference. And I have to say that I'm very worried about the things that we hear, that vaccines are being used without a proper clinical evaluation. This is potentially very detrimental in relation to acceptance of vaccines. I think these are the things where we need to be coordinated, and where, with all what we are doing, we need to really stick to the highest rigors as we used to do it for vaccines. And then I think comes communication and also engagement of communities as it needs to be done for other vaccines as well.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
Please do, Stanley.
I'm looking far ahead in the future. I would anticipate that, as I indicated before, that vaccination against SARS-2 would become mandatory or highly recommended, or however you want to put it, and that it will become a travel issue. In other words, if someone from Afghanistan wants to travel to the US, that individual might need a document saying that he or she has been vaccinated against SARS-2. I'm anticipating here that the disease will be under control in the developed countries that can afford large-scale vaccination. And so the issue, as with yellow fever, for example, will be you don't want to import it into your country. Over.
If I may just, I think, Stanley, that's well possible that, you know, in the longer run we'll come to such a situation. I would not exclude this, absolutely. Just to flag that the countries that have been controlling with non-pharmaceutical interventions so far. You can do it.
I guess we have a topic for our next ADVAC course, first debate on the mandatory vaccination, so we can do the COVID vaccine there next May. Thanks for that idea, Stanley. Let me ask our panelists from India. We have Gagandeep Kang from the Translational Health Science Technology in Institute of India, whether you would want to comment on any of the topics that we've raised so far.
Thank you, Hannah. You know, a lot of people use Cherry because it's easier, but yeah, you actually got my name right this time. So thanks for trying, and thanks for getting that right. You know, I'd really like to talk about the topic for this, which is the deployment of vaccines. And this is a significant concern for us because, as you're aware, you know, India has the largest immunization program in the world. And it has that largest immunization program in the world for just its birth cohort. Just immunizing 30 million pregnant women every year, 27 million children every year. And we are looking only at the first year of immunization already means 9 million immunization systems. Now we are talking about immunizing 20% of the population that does not fit into what is the largest immunization program in the world. So if this vaccine is going to be something, we need to be thinking about cold chain, we need to be thinking about vaccinators, we need to be thinking about the people who are identified as beneficiaries of the immunization program, which means line listing the individuals due for immunization and then tracking whether they got the vaccine or not. Building that system takes time, it takes effort. And I'm not sure that we can do this, and the same will be true of many other large countries, without damaging what already exists. If you ask the current system to take on what we are asking of it now, which is 500 million doses in the 20% that may come to India, then we actually need to be building a whole new program. And that requires a fair amount of planning. Now, if we come to this vaccine only protects for 3 years or protects for 2 years, you're talking about a sustainable expansion of what then becomes a routine immunization program. And that's going to be a whole different scale of challenge that we need to think about. And from an Indian perspective, it is going to require sustainable manufacturing, which means it needs to come from developing country vaccine manufacturers, because there is no way a multinational is going to make enough vaccine for us to be able to use for our kinds of cohorts. And that brings me back in a circuitous fashion to what Peter said about follow-on vaccines and the challenges that these vaccines are going to have to be evaluated for clinical efficacy. What are the sizes of the trials going to be? If you can't do a placebo-controlled trial, so what are the strategies that we are thinking about for the eventuality that we are going to continue to need hundreds of millions, if not billions of doses of vaccine every year in the future? So I have a lot more to say, but I will stop with that. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks a lot, Cherry, Gaganda, Deep. Yeah, it really puts this into very different perspective. Are there, Joachim, do you care to comment, or other panelists care to comment on Cherry's concerns?
I mean, I think Cherry is right. I mean, you put the challenge out there. That's what that is there, and I think what you said is, and I mean, that's a big concern in the immunization world, is how can you do that without damaging the system as it is there, moving all resources away from our existing programs in order to meet that challenge. So I think that is indeed the problem that we have ahead. And I think we'll probably be talking about initially very highly targeted vaccination, which also has its problems.
I think Cherry is being too modest for India. And I think that one of the major changes in the world is the movement of manufacture of vaccines outside of North America and Europe. The Serum Institute of India, Bharat, Biological E, and others will be capable, in my view, of producing vaccine for India and also for export. As you all know, the Serum Institute of India is now, in terms of doses, the largest manufacturer in the world. So I don't see that as a problem eventually. I mean, assuming that they have access to the manufacture of effective vaccines against COVID-19.
Hannah, if I can just comment, I don't disagree that the Indian manufacturers have the capacity to make 500 million, 1 billion doses of vaccine every year. If the platform is right, it certainly can be done. My worry is about the bar that we will set for the evaluation of those vaccines if they are not a technology transfer from a multinational, and the sustainable deployment of vaccines to populations that we've never covered before. Over.
Thanks for that reminder. Let me take one comment from the floor. That's Esteban Ortiz Prado from Ecuador, ADVAC 2015, who is asking whether many comments about the COVAX strategy providing vaccines to developing countries, including those from Latin America, Any guess if this will allow us to receive the vaccine in a timely manner or cheaper? Who would care to take Esteban's question?
I can take that question, Hannah. Thank you, Stefan, for that question. I think if the country has signed up to the COVAX facility, I think once a safe and efficacious vaccine are licensed and available through the COVAX facility, if a country has signed up, it should be in principle available and accessible for any country in the world at the same time. Indeed, as Joachim, I think, mentioned before, to avoid where we were back in 2009, that LMICs were sort of at the back of the line to receiving vaccines for pandemic flu at that time. This is why the COVAX facility was created, really also to have equitable access for those that are in need. Over.
Thanks, Gabrielle. And now that you're there, do you have any messages from the CEPI for the ADVACers?
Sure, absolutely. Love to be here. As most of you know, we began supporting the development of COVID-19 vaccines back in January already. And now under the COVAX pillar, we actually have a diverse portfolio, I would say, of vaccine candidates. And really, the ultimate goal is, as everyone knows, is to rapidly deliver sufficient vaccines for global use in emergency conditions at scale. And as a target, we hope to deliver 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. So as some of you may know, there are currently 37 vaccines in the clinical development pipeline, and 8 of these are included in the COVAX portfolio, of which 3 are already in late stage development, which is amazingly fast. So with that rapid progress in vaccine development globally, so including also the manufacturing at scale, the tech transfers that are currently ongoing, that are just beginning. There are also quite a few deployment challenges to face, particularly in low research settings, and some of the panelists and Joachim also have alluded to some of them. I think what we are looking at right now, this is one I wanted to mention, is actually the initial vaccines that come to market, hopefully early next year. Most of those will be a 2-dose vaccine. And that with that, there are certain issues associated with that. Preferably, we would want to have a 1-dose vaccine because it immediately gives immunity, so you can sort of quicker curb the pandemic. Other challenges that we are looking at also from a regulatory perspective is I think at the moment we have now 180 economies that have signed up to the COVAX facility. Of course, the COVID vaccines need to be licensed in those countries, and with that comes labeling. You know, obviously we need to have some harmonization in place, because this is for the developers already, otherwise completely impossible to have a specific label for every country. We need to have a good understanding of vaccines demand forecasting. There will be issues with vaccine storage, with cold chain requirements, particularly as we will have in our portfolio, we have some mRNA vaccine that require ultra cold chain, meaning -70, -80. These are challenging field conditions. So, and all of these different questions, in addition to other challenges that you all already have discussed about, we need to address that concurrently and an accelerated pace. So quite a few challenges still ahead of us. Over.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Joachim, do you have a comment to Gabrielle, or shall we move on with the?
No, this is fine. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So let me take Nicolas Peyraud from Médecins Sans Frontières. who is having several questions. He's an ADVACer 2016, and he's asking on how WHO will encourage access for humanitarian settings and how WHO will advocate to guarantee access to stateless populations, those with unclear legal status and minorities, migrants, refugees, IDPs, ethnic minorities, exclusion from health system. There is the humanitarian buffer to secure access and allocation of COVID-19 medical products, but how to ensure we will have something working in practice and not only on paper? How to make sure civil societies will be part of the implementation of these vaccines for specific vulnerable groups? And this is something, Joachim, we discussed in the SAGE, and could you please share what our thinking were?
Yeah, I think these are obviously very important considerations. I mean, the first thing that we have tried to do is obviously to reflect these particularly fragile populations in our roadmap. They are listed in the roadmap as groups with significantly socio-demographic groups with significantly higher risk of severe disease and death. It sounds a bit abstract, but you know, there's a lot of explanation behind this. So I think that is absolutely clear. We need to say also that we do not have an awful lot of information in terms of disease and disease transmission in these populations. So I think also empiric data would be extremely helpful. In terms of, so to say, where the vaccine is coming from, I think this is a really important point to flag, and I think we have been discussing this, and obviously you are very well familiar. There is the plan to establish a buffer for humanitarian emergencies. I do not have now, as we are sitting here, the details and what is being the plan, how this will be governed and used. So I can only say that this is a topic that is intensely looked at, both from the side of the vaccine supply as well as on the side in terms of prioritizing these populations, what specific mechanisms people want to put in place in order to make this happen, knowing that countries may not necessarily be particularly keen to vaccinate these populations as they may be sitting between the chairs, so to say. That's something which I cannot address as we speak. I don't know, Hannah, or if anybody on the group wants to add to this.
Not for my part. Any other panelists who would want to address the vulnerable groups? If not, then let me take the other question from Nicholas Perron, because it's quite relevant to the discussion that Gagan was also starting, is how WHO and other actors as Gavi will support a real global increase in production of COVID-19 vaccines through non-exclusive licensing and other intellectual property IP measures, that is, advocate for intellectual property barriers to be alleviated through conditionalities on public funding, government measures, and global IP reform. For example, promote transparent technology transfer, etc. Who would want to take that on board?
I don't know. I don't know if Gabrielle can say something from the CEPI perspective. I think from our perspective, I mean, the most important thing is pricing, right? This is and the ability to transfer technology in a way that we get the necessary volume manufacturing. Gabriela, I don't know if there's a particular perspective from CEPI.
Sure, I can do that. I mean, I think as part of COVAX, really, the aim is to deliver fair and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines to those that need them the most, regardless of where they live or whether they can afford it. So indeed, price is very important to that. So in the fastest as well in the fairest way possible to bring the pandemic globally to a manageable stage. We know for sure that the initial global demand for COVID-19 vaccine is going to vastly outstrip the supply that we will have. So, as already mentioned, we have to carefully manage this scarce resource so that we have the greatest possible impact. So as I mentioned already, we are planning to produce 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. And all countries that participate in COVAX, regardless of income levels, will have equal access to these vaccines once they are developed. So in addition, by also prioritizing the most vulnerable first, or the most those at risk, wherever they are on the planet, we hope to finish the acute phase of the pandemic more rapidly. So, from our perspective, also, I don't necessarily think that IP is the issue, but rather the access to the vaccine, meaning in-country accessibility and affordability. So from a CEPI perspective, we have no expectations to hold any IP. I know that there is, I think back in March, the Costa Rican government actually initiated an initiative which is intended to improve access to treatments and vaccines. It's called, I think, CTAP. I think this was taken up also by Gavi. Maybe I'm not fully familiar with that, so maybe somebody else on the panelists may know more about it, where the current initiative is per se, because what they're planning is to increase voluntary licenses from the developers to other developers, but I'm not entirely sure where it stands right now. But I know it's built on the expertise and the strategies developed by the Medicine Patent Pool, which was founded by UNITAID. So maybe somebody else can report on that. Over.
Among the panelists, any wisdom on this, on the patent pool?
I don't have
Stanley,
I don't have any wisdom on the subject, but I do think it is an extremely important one, because let's face it, there are, as everybody knows, numerous candidate vaccines, and looking at them optimistically, I think that I would imagine that probably about a dozen of them will show some efficacy and eventually be licensed. So we're going to face a situation that we have not faced before, with multiple manufacturers from multiple countries, and with different vaccines, not manufacturing exactly the same vaccine, but different ones. And that means the prices are likely to be different. We already know that some of them are going to be more expensive inherently than others. And, you know, I don't have any, I'm not an economist, and I don't have any easy answer to that. But I do think it's going to require a lot of involvement of governments. And coming from the United States, where the government has been uninvolved in vaccine manufacture, that is going to have to change. And that's all I can say.
Thanks, Stanley. Thanks for the excellent question also. We have still about 20 minutes time, and we have three panelists: Angela Gentile from Ricardo Gutierrez Children's Hospital in Argentina. What is your message to the ADVACers here?
Yes, thank you so much, Hannah, for the possibility to talk about Latin American region. Just now, we are in the epicenter of the COVID pandemic currently in the world. We are in the first wave of the pandemic, and countries are at different stages of the epidemic, including some countries with no or limited transmission. But picture is really very dynamic. The highest incidence rate, accumulate incidence rate at October 9 were in Peru, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and the highest mortality rate at the same time are in Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, so different pictures. But all the countries are working so hard to try to face the crisis, not only public health crisis, but also economic crisis in Latin America. On the other hand, given the burden of the disease, the high incidence rate, several phase 3 studies are being conducted in Latin American countries. Vaccines that we are using just now in this phase 3 are Pfizer vaccine, inactivated vaccines, that's like Sinopharm or Sinovac, the Chinese vaccines, are others that use adenovirus as a vector, such as CanSino, that are working in the region. It is very important to highlight an agreement that the region has made with AstraZeneca and Oxford University. There will be a technology transfer, and the concentrate antigen is just now being working in Argentina in a private company, Vaccines, and in Mexico is going to work on the fragmentation and production stage of the vaccine vials, and then they are going to distribute to the entire region. This agreement could cover 20% of the population of Latin American countries, and it would include especially healthcare workers, and then perhaps elderly. And third, the underlying disease. Each country is working with the Ministry of Public Health and the NITAC committees to try to work on this type of policy. But this agreement with the transfer of technology is very important for the region. Brazil is a work also at the same type of agreement with transfer of technology from Brazil. It's a special agreement, different of this that I am talking about. It is possible, perhaps, that it will be sufficient to cover all the health group with a single lab, only with AstraZeneca and with this agreement. So each country is working very hard. And another point from Latin America is that all countries purchase calendar vaccines through the PAHO revolving fund. Through COVAX, this work policy will continue, and all the countries are working, the NITACs, Ministry of Public Health, with PAHO in this revolving fund to try to see what we are going to work in on the future. So the panorama, the picture is so challenged. Perhaps for me the most important things is what happened with this type of agreement with transfers of technology, and to try to produce these vaccines, not also in Brazil, that is a hard experience about that, but also with this new agreement between Argentina and Mexico for the region. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Angela, and it's really interesting to see how we're seeing South-South collaboration and collaboration with companies that previously were not there on the landscape. So this is really an exciting time in that sense, but challenging at the same time. Let me take one question from the audience, from Moa, who is asking an interesting question, saying that, will you anticipate any potential damage to COVID vaccination or vaccination in general as a result of the large-scale vaccination with many COVID vaccines that are less well understood, that is current vaccination without phase 3 data, without the appropriate endpoints, potential enhanced disease issue, etc. How can we prepare to address those? So if any of the panelists would care to comment on that.
I can take that question, Hannah.
Yes.
Very good question. I think right now it's crucial. Well, we don't even have phase 3 efficacy data. We need already to think about those post-licensure studies globally. So I know that already quite a few initiatives ongoing at the European level thinking about this, but we need to think about this also for low to middle income countries where pharmacovigilance has been less than optimal, I would say, because yes, indeed, that if there is a signal that we could miss, this could really harm COVID-19 vaccination programs, I would say. So it's a very big question, something that we need to start now already. Well, we're still in the clinical trials, but and also I think an important point is as well is like, because this always has been a recurrent question, is about the funding of the post-licensure studies, the monitoring, and the assessment of the effectiveness of these different COVID-19 vaccines in real life circumstances. Over.
Thanks, Gabriel, for that answer. And maybe I could invite the panelist Nadine Sicard from the Ministry of Health and Social Service in Quebec, Canada, whether you would comment also on the phase 4 and then also deliver your message to this forum.
Okay, thank
Nadine?
you, Hannah. Hi,
Yeah.
good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Hannah. Yes, we're also planning in our province at this stage in terms of how we're going to do some enhanced monitoring and what types of studies we could do to ensure we have some good data on anticipated events following immunization, and certainly there would be some collaborations with other provinces or also the Public Health Agency of Canada, but this work is underway, and I don't have much details to share with the group today about this. In terms of some of the work that's been happening in Canada, there's some plans for a release of a framework for prioritization of groups to be immunized. It's underway, and it should be made publicly available sometime towards the end of October or early November. So when it's available, I can share with the ADVAC Secretariat if you would like. But having seen some draft of the documents, I think that it's more general than the work that SAGE has been doing and was presented earlier. The experts involved in this decision-making were concerned that they didn't want to go too far in their recommendations until we have more data from the phase 2 trials, and also the volumes and the quantities of vaccine available and their characteristics. So in Canada, there's been some advanced procurement agreements so far with 6 manufacturers. There should be 2 more to be announced publicly. We're being asked to start planning for vaccine administration in the first half of 2021, which is very challenging, with some of the products having some very complicated cold chain requirements, population being very dispersed and in small numbers in some areas of Canada makes it challenging to think about the logistics of, for example, frozen products, but we're trying to wrap our heads around those issues. And perhaps one of some items that we've been thinking about in terms of the sequencing that I haven't heard in the discussion so far is the level of exposure of, for example, the healthcare workers or some of the essential workers of some of the groups, and how much can this exposure can be controlled with some of the other measures that are available, for example, negative pressure rooms, personal protective equipment, etc. So to give a more concrete example of this, we've seen a lot of cases of COVID-19 in healthcare workers working with the elderly in retirement homes and those types of settings. even though they have the available protective equipment. But in the designated centers with the ICUs, with all the critical patients, where there's a lot of aerosolization procedures and whatnot, there's almost no outbreaks or no cases. So it seems that the measures and the infrastructures that are in place for some people that are more exposed are better than in other settings. So we're also thinking about a criteria for priority setting is whether what's the level of control that of the exposure that is available to the exposed individual. So maybe that's something to think about as well for the sequencing. Thank you.
Thanks, and that actually points to the fact that each country should understand their own systems and their own risk factors and kind of put the SAGE prioritization table into their own country national context. Thanks, Nadia, for that. And our last panelist is Jane Soepardi from Indonesia, working with the CDC Atlanta in Indonesia. Jane, would you want to give your views to the prioritization and vaccination challenges?
Okay, thank you, Hannah. It is clear from Joachim's presentation that the goal of this COVID-19 vaccine is not only to protect humans, but also to control the pandemic by stopping the transmission. Each country or each region of big countries are in different stages of the epidemics. Some has capacity and succeeded to stop or control the epidemics through testing, tracing, and isolation, such as Thailand. But some are not, like Indonesia. Countries need help with available data, such as the seroprevalence study or the modeling, analysis of secondary data to understand that country epidemic situation, so that that country could come up with a specific plan for vaccination. Different vaccination plan for different states of epidemics. Besides those already stated in the roadmap, I'd like to suggest the vaccination for school children, Professor Stanley. Before country open schools, besides the priority group like the health and social workers, older people, and medical risk groups, in Southeast Asia countries, cases and deaths among children are reported higher than other regions. About the COVID-19 vaccine, it may provide only moderate protection. Some vaccines may be abruptly withdrawn from the market because they turn out not to be safe. This might cause chaos. Each company is running its own trial. And about the WHO Solidarity trial asked before, that plan to start in October seems not started yet. Countries would like to know which company agreed to with these mega trials to some common ground rules and shared some data. I think that's all. Over to you, Hannah. Thank you.
Okay, Jane, there were several questions in there. Shall we put to Stanley the vaccination of school children?
Well, you know, when we have effective vaccines against COVID-19, ultimately, when we have enough vaccine for everybody, I would certainly recommend that children be vaccinated. The question that needs to be answered, however, is where is the reservoir of infection? In the US, my impression is that the reservoir is not in children going to grade school, but that the reservoir is in adolescents and young adults and perhaps older adults as well, but not the elderly. They're not the reservoir. they are secondarily infected. So again, this should be a universal vaccine eventually, but in as much as we have to give priorities because we don't have enough vaccine yet, as everybody knows, healthcare workers and the elderly have been given the highest priority because of exposure and because of the risk of death. But we're not going to stop this epidemic. I mean, everybody knows this until we have, it's been estimated, 60–70% vaccine coverage. And that's going to require massive immunization of all age groups eventually. So I think that's all that one can say at the moment, because we need to learn things that we don't yet know for sure, that have been mentioned during this discussion.
Just to add to what Stanley said, I mean, I think elimination is actually a long, long way down the road. I don't think we're going to be looking at elimination of virus for many, many years. Not only are we going to require a highly efficacious vaccine that works against transmission of the virus, and that's, you know, that's not 70 or 80%. That's going to be a 90% vaccine, which gives durable immunity. Only then, I think, can we begin to think about elimination. And I think at this stage where we are, that's a distant dream. I think for the coming years, we just have to focus on alleviating the burden of morbidity and mortality that's occurring in those high-risk groups. I think I just answered in the chat. I think at the moment, children are near the bottom of the list for vaccination. I think Stanley said that earlier. They don't seem to be at high risk of severe disease, though I'm interested in what Jane said about what might be the situation in Indonesia, but that's not been the general. The graph that Joachim showed on this sort of infection mortality ratio with age is pretty consistent, that children are at really very low risk of severe disease. They're also at very unimportant, or not compared to other groups, with respect to transmission. So that if one's going to vaccinate anybody, and I am concerned that sort of children lose out on education, but if one's going to vaccinate anyone, one should vaccinate their teachers, so that teachers don't have to take time off sick in order to stop teaching them, rather than vaccinating the children, which I think is going to be a very limited value. Over.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. And may I read to you what Joseph Weigel is saying here. He says that given the pandemic handling of Sweden, wouldn't it be straightforward to vaccinate risk groups by disease and exposure, and then reduce the non-pharmaceutical interventions and go the Swedish way? Then all aspects of counterproductive imprinting, etc., are resolved by itself. Otherwise, we lose focus and risk vaccine approaches by principle. So that's Joseph's take of the discussion. Now, I'm conscious of time, that we only have 2 more minutes, and I would turn this over to Philippe Duclos. You've been handling with the question and answer box, and is there something major that we haven't handled until now, which you would, Philip, want to raise before we close?
You're on mute, Philip.
We can't hear you, Philip.
Yes, sorry, apologies. Yes, indeed, there have been many other questions, and we won't be able to do justice to all. Some actually I removed because they were indirectly covered by the discussion. Perhaps I would lift a couple of the remaining answers, and apologies for the other of you whose question will remain answered. The question perhaps that has been interesting is in terms of duration of protection. If one has to give a vaccine a second time, and would the efficacy of the second dose or vaccine potentially be lower than that given the first time? So it's surely a challenge, and the person is going to ask basically how these issues will be faced by current trials and would impact in future studies. That's from Martin Rumbo.
Was that a question?
I think that was a question, a challenging question.
I would say in summary that in my view, almost all of the vaccines will require 2 doses for maximum efficacy. And that includes the vectored vaccines, that apparently includes messenger RNA vaccines. That being said, there are, it's been argued that there are exceptions, and that maybe some of the vaccines will be better or will be good with 1 single dose. There are even attenuated SARS-2 vaccines being developed, and they could be a 1-dose vaccine. But I do think from the data that I've seen thus far that 2 doses for most vaccines are going to be necessary for maximum efficacy.
Yeah, thank you. I think part of the question was also in terms of the need for booster doses down the road after the primary vaccination. So will the immunity be long-lasting or not? And if it's not long-lasting, I mean, then it will call for repeat doses over time that may go down in terms of protection.
Quien sabe?
Was there anything else, Philip, that is really burning? Because it is.
I just think on that issue, the problem is we're not going to know that, because in fact we might be able to measure immunogenicity, but because the trials will probably stop follow-up and vaccinate the placebo group early, rather than in most new vaccines where you have a placebo group for a long time, you won't know whether this vaccine actually loses protection with time. It might be possible to sort of randomize people to get a booster dose or not and get an evaluation there. But I think, again, it's an area where there's a lot of uncertainty, and the idea that these vaccines will offer sort of very long protection, it's a hope, but I'm not sure how realistic it is. And I think there's also this issue that for some vaccines that was raised in the question, that actually the second or the third or fourth dose may be much less effective than the first dose, just because of the way in which the vaccine is constructed, and you're getting, as it were, immunity to the vaccine rather than to the agent.
Especially with the adenovirus vectored vaccines, are you concerned about the others as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a concern.
Yeah. Well,
there was actually, perhaps in relation or indirectly in relation with that, some concerns expressed by the public or potential concerns expressed by the public on DNA or RNA vaccines. And some of the people wanted some comment on that in terms of safety concern.
But you know, Philip, it sounds to me that when I look at these questions, that we need a series of webinars on the COVID vaccines. That there are just so many areas that need to be addressed separately. That is the phase 4 study designs, and it's the safety issues and all of that. So we may want to think on what is the ADVACers need to know more, and talk to those people who are working on these things. I mean, I'm conscious that we run over our time right now, and we should stop here to let people go to their activities. But I thank very, very much all the panelists and all the active ADVACers who are dealing with these things in their everyday life. And let's, Philip, think about on how we could serve the ADVAC family and network in the way that we can answer to those questions, and provide this kind of a possibility to air out thoughts, which I think is so important with us in ADVAC, and which you can't necessarily do with all your colleagues. So over to you, Philip, after I thank all of those present here very, very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I want indeed to close with thanking Joachim for a wonderful presentation, and you, Hannah, for a masterful sharing, as well as all the discussants for their very good contribution, very productive, but also all the participants. I think these are rich discussions, again, as you pointed, Anna, that cannot be closed right now. And I would also encourage all the participants to look back at the public material that will be posted on the SAGE website, because there were two important COVID-related sessions with all material and presentations made public. So it's a gold mine of information, and you've been also invited to join the IABS webinar that will take place on 16th of October, i.e. very soon, in only a few days. I also want to thank Carol Beresville. She has been silent during this webinar, but she has been very actively helping in the background in preparing, as you know. So I would to thank her for her help in supporting this one webinar and the webinars at large. I want to remind you that our next webinar will be on November 5th, and we'll address the topic of communication around the deployment of COVID vaccines. And there were quite a few questions around that actually I suppressed directly because they were to be covered in the coming webinar. I also want to tell you that we are recording this webinar, and we're planning to put it, of course, on the alumni website. But I hope, and with Joachim's permission, if you don't object, that we could make this webinar recording more public, hopefully fully public, in providing a link. If there is any reservation, we can discuss that later on. But I think there's a lot of value in allowing access to these webinars, to these discussions, not only for ADVAC alumni, but also for alumni from other vaccinology courses and other interested parties. No problem. Great. And I assume that the discussants also are happy with that. If there was any issue, please let me know quickly by email before we make the link public. So again, a big thank you to all of you, and good afternoon, good evening, or good night to wherever you are in the world. So thank you very much.
All right.
Right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.